I've been doing technical diving for over a decade. Something about the ocean and all of its undiscovered wonders has always drawn me in. An entire uncharted, alien world lurks beneath us, waiting to reveal its secrets to those brave enough to take the plunge. I suppose you could say diving is my passion. It's been my whole adult life. I can't even go near the deep end of the pool anymore without having a panic attack. It all started when one of my best friends approached me with the idea of going on a short trip. Fred had a fairly formidable boat on which he made a living by engaging in, just let's say, less than legal activities. In any case, a reputable character who Fred assists in moving cargo into the country had told him about a cave several miles off the coast of his own country, redacted. To be honest, no matter how much time I spend researching how we ended up 100 feet below sea level, I'll never understand why or how I agreed to such a foolish idea. It doesn't really matter anymore. At 99 feet below sea level, the pressure on your body that the atmosphere normally exerts is quadrupled. The sunlight tries vainly to break through the darkness. Darkness reigns supreme, and all who live there are creatures of the night. I checked my depth and air pressure gauges and looked up to see Fred's hand motioning for me to follow him to the cave's mouth. I flutter-kicked silently forward, floating just above the seaweed and silt-covered ocean floor, taking in as much as my low-profile, narrow-lens mask would allow. Fred dropped to the floor and clipped his line to a formation near the cave's mouth when we arrived. This is a critical step in cave diving. That was the only way we could get out of the system. I kept my light on his hands while he worked, but my gaze returned to the cave's mouth. The darkness was as oppressive as it had always been, but there was something off. At the time, I couldn't put my finger on it. The ominous black maw was more intense than it should have been. I then heard it. A low-pitched roar came from the depths. A thunderous echo echoed from so far below that it was barely audible when it reached us. That's the peculiar thing about your hearing when you dive that deep. You feel as well as hear. It's in your chest. In your bones. My stomach dropped as the noise echoed through me. We hadn't come this far for nothing, so we dutifully continued. Fred held the line and made the first entrance, and I trailed behind, my hand trailing along the line as it unfurled. We had only kicked about 30 to 40 feet into the system when my light caught a silver glint against the backdrop of darkness and neutral-toned rock formations. Fred signaled that he saw it as well, and we came to a halt. The narrow beam cast itself on the object as I kicked myself over to it. The only sound was the soft rhythmic beat of our exhales as they bubbled up to the tunnel's roof. The glint revealed a scuba tank half buried in the silt. Many cave divers bring extra safety rigs with them. When you're 100 feet underground and surrounded by a rock ceiling, the last thing you want is to run out of air. But who would abandon this? We clipped it to our line with the intention of bringing it back with us on the return trip. We came across our first fork as we dug deeper into the system. Fred motioned to me. He was asking which direction I thought we should take. My camera moved back and forth between the two tunnels. It was suffocated by the abysmal nothingness only 10 feet ahead. The constant pressure squeezed me like a python coiling around its prey. It felt oppressive. I felt a slight current brush across my skin as I stood in the cold, dark water. It was coming from the left tunnel. We continued our exploration after I motioned to the left. We were 110 feet down. Even for an experienced diver, the pressure was too much. Something caught the focused beam of my light several kick paces in. It was abnormal. It stood out like a sore thumb among the rocky stalagmites in my peripheral vision. I stepped over to it with grace, taking care not to disturb the silt at the cave's bottom. After being stirred, silt takes a long time to settle back down. We needed more time than the air tanks provided. If I thought my vision was poor before, a silt storm would render me completely blind. I settled and focused on the thing that had caught my eye once I had reached my point of fixation. I discovered it to be a diver's slate after pulling it from its sunken place in the sand. Divers are unable to communicate verbally underwater, so what cannot be communicated through commonly recognized hand motions is written on a slate and passed to one another. I made out the hastily written words by shining my narrow beam onto its surface. Refrigerator size. Black skin that is smooth. dolphin-like with some humanoid characteristics. Contrary thumbs? I passed the slate to Fred, who read it and tucked it away in his gear pouch after a worried glance at me. We kept moving forward. As we got closer to the end of the tunnel, the wall started to close in on my shoulders. It became so narrow at one point that I had to remove my tank and pass it through the opening before attempting to slither through myself. I became stuck for a brief moment. It was set in motion by the familiar panic. To calm myself, I took several slow breaths. Then I exhaled every last drop of air in my lungs until I was just thin enough to push myself through. The system opened up on the other side of this barrier. We ended up on a small ledge that dropped into a large chamber. I noted the horizontal boundaries by shining my light around the perimeter. My light was snuffed out by the overwhelming blackness as I turned my narrow beam down toward what should have been the chamber's floor. To this day, I have no idea how far it could have reached. I sat at the bottom of the ledge, peering over the edge. My right knee landed on something hard the moment my knees touched the sand. I reached into the sand and pulled it from its resting place. It turned out to be a video camera. Clearly a high-end one as well. Whoever came this far before had to have wanted to record their journey. Fumbling with the controls, I turned it on and positioned my light on the playback screen to see the most recently recorded video. I recognized the site of the obstacle we had just pushed our way through as the video began. The frame reached the end of the ledge we were now on and began panning around the room. It's strange watching a video underwater. It had the effect of a silent horror film because there was no sound. The déjà vu feeling I had seeing my current surroundings did not put me at ease. The camera then panned down to the cavern's floor and back up from the abyss to rest on the figure of a diver standing next to the cameraman. It was clearly the dive buddy of whoever was shooting. When the diver in the frame turned to face the camera, a strange dark figure shot across the frame and out of view. The diver initially appeared exactly as he had a moment before. Then he grasped his throat. He clasped both hands around his neck, as if choking. Then wisps of dark red blood emerged from his grip, spreading their reach across the dark water like malevolent fingers. The figure shot across the frame from a different angle and out of sight. The diver's mask and regulator had vanished, as had a large, haphazardly torn section of his face. As the blood swirled violently, dyeing the water in view, the camera frame shook in obvious shock. The still twitching body floated limply forward until the figure rocketed by again and it vanished, dragged down into the darkness. The frame peered over the ledge until it was violently smacked and the screen went black. A roar erupted from the silence of nothingness. I dropped the camera, startled. Fred motioned to my left, clearly panicked, to return the way we came. I kicked my way back to the narrow passageway and began the arduous task of shoving myself through. I turned to assist Fred after barely clearing the obstacle. He passed his tank to me, and I grabbed it. In a panicked rush, he pushed his head and shoulders through. His body took up the entire passageway, and all I could see was his head poking out through the rocks. But before he could make any further progress, his head jerked in a sickening manner. As he screamed in agony, bubbles erupted from his regulator. Blood began to seep through the opening and stain the water around us red. I desperately tried to pull him through, but as I did, I felt something pulling back the other way. Fred's regulator flooded the chamber with purged air bubbles as his agonizing screams propelled them violently toward the tunnel's roof. The regulator fell from his mouth, and his head fell lifelessly down. I realized, horrified, that whatever that godforsaken thing was on the other side. The only thing keeping it from pursuing me was my friend's lifeless corpse. As more blood poured into my side of the obstacle, the aquatic roar grew louder. This was my chance, I realized. I admit, with shame, that I left my friend there so that I could make my escape. My heart pounded as I swam with all my might to the cave system's entrance. I made an erroneous emergency ascent to the surface without pausing to decompress. The risk of the bends was worth it just to get out of that fucking water. A month has passed since then. After what seemed like an eternity in a hyperbaric chamber, I finally recovered from the bends. I can't stand the thought of swimming, let alone diving. I'm not even sure why. All the proof I had of that wretched thing is buried in that cave with my friend's body. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. I'm barely hanging on to my sanity as it is. I had to inform someone. Somehow. So I'll put it here. Hopefully, this will serve as a warning to those who seek the mysteries of the deep. My job includes tracking and cataloging the various types of demon personas that roam the earth. Fremont Earhart is my name, and I come from a long line of demon catalogers. I am completely overworked and underpaid, and I have received no health, dental, or other benefits since beginning this job. My esteemed cousins, the Montgomery family, would also argue that my job is far less sexy and far less cool than their position as the Crown's premier demon hunters. Of course, I'd like to argue the opposite. Okay, I have cool days every now and then. For instance, consider the other day. I'd been following this thing across the Pacific Northwest, watching as it wreaked havoc from town to town. Consider the climactic fight scene in the Transformer films. There's fire and debris everywhere. Skyscrapers were destroyed, and bodies were found in the street. I'd tracked it down to a small town outside of Paterson, New Jersey, and was listening to the shriek of police scanners as the engorged demon tore through the streets in search of more human meat. I brought my trusty computer and was hard at work in a nearby coffee shop. I'd had a rough day. The night before, I'd celebrated a friend's birthday, and she'd ordered entrees for the table without informing me that the pizza wasn't dairy-free. So the entire morning had been spent with Tums, Advil, and an upset stomach. Demons are clearly not from this plane of existence. Philosophers, historians, and scientists all have different theories about where these specific beings of energy come from, theologians, too, but because they're so far off the mark, I've decided not to include them in this roundup. I've heard it all: alternate dimensions, karmic energy recycled, fallen beasts from overlapping universes. The truth is that no one knows. What we have done is identified them. However, I'm getting ahead of myself. This day, I believe it was a Tuesday, was especially pleasant. I'd tracked that demon down to a defunct paper mill on the outskirts of the main strip. A group of people had taken refuge there, hoping that the thick steel walls would protect them. There were a lot of whining and wailing, as well as calling out ritualistic words I'd heard used in prayers to their sky god. Nobody thought to draw a perimeter or try to barricade the steel doors. Useless. Anyways, the demon saw this as an opportunity for a tasty snack and exhibited the aggressive predator skills I'd seen before. The poison-tipped hooked dewclaws, the hardened armor plates around the vulnerable underbelly, and the displayed, blood-red fan around its eyeless face, similar to the fan-throated dragon lizard here on Earth. But as it moved in for the kill, I noticed it pause. I was completely taken aback. It's Harg month, and this fucking killing machine doesn't pause. What was the situation? This thing was ready to shred these humans into spaghettios, claws and teeth out. It was now frozen in place, crouched over the weeping, gibbering humans who had backed themselves into a mill corner. The humans had backed themselves into the small space beneath the massive metal stairs that led to all three levels of the old, decaying paper mill. The stairs themselves were crumbling, posing a serious safety hazard and a major workplace violation. Rusted swaths of the stairs were red, with corroded metal piling up an inch thick. Rust and iron. Perhaps this had something to do with it? I was crouched near the crime scene, frantically taking notes. I'd been distracted by my upset stomach that morning and had accidentally left my hotspot at home, so I couldn't use my computer all the way out here. Fortunately, I discovered my old black book, blood ink pen, and voice recorder in the backseat of my black Prius, so I was able to use those instead. The Hardmonth was straining, poison dripping from its claws as it worked furiously to reach the whining meat bags. It was clear that it wanted to get to the humans, but something was preventing it from accomplishing its ultimate goal of creating a slew of little piles of human meat. But what exactly was it? Ah yes. There. Front and center is a human girl. Darker skin tone, brown, curly hair. Her age is estimated to be between 15 and 16 years old, and she is holding a large cross to her chest. Is it silver or iron? Chanting the same prayers as everyone else. Yes, other people are still crying. But this human girl. I took a breather. This human girl hasn't taken her gaze away from the beast. I set it into my tape recorder. Interesting. Very intriguing. It appears that the Hardmonth is reacting to the prayers. Alternatively, to her. I took notes. She's worth keeping an eye on. I'll return later. After recording the observations and cataloging the phenomena, it was time to clean up the mess and call in the cousins. I took out the suitcase BLU-82 and tuned it to the frequencies that corresponded to the human's heartbeats. After a particularly messy case involving the Romans and a large cult following almost 1,991 years ago, basically, a small group of renegade humans had made exposure of the Lilith demon we were on the verge of almost subduing, resulting in wide-scale exposure. The Crown had then tasked us with developing a weapon that could target only specific individuals, resulting in immediate results with minimal damage. As a result, the BLU-82 was born. Set it to specific frequencies, such as location, heartbeats, a crowd number, or even a mugshot, and the resulting blast would only affect those individuals. In this case, after performing the necessary calculations, I set it off to dispatch these human meat suits. But not before I let go of that particular human girl. I'm not a fan of humans. In fact, I find them vile, impulsive, and downright fleshy, but I admire those who demonstrate tenacity in order to survive. Then I summoned my cousins. They rode in on literal white horses and dispatched the demon in record time. All that was left for me after it was returned to the dimension from which it came was the case paperwork, which I completed in my Brooklyn loft with hot cocoa and my heated blanket. Overall, it was a pleasant day. My job entails tracking and categorizing the 5 major types of Demonia Animalis. Hardmonth is the largest of the 5 Demonia Animalis. It is strong, beastly, angry, and nearly impossible to subdue. Its earthly body resembles a large, bloated lizard. The Hardmonth has 10 massive, hooked claws on each of its 4 legs and is usually dark green, black, or a dark blue-black. The hooked claws are tipped with the most lethal poison on the planet, capable of paralyzing in seconds. The Hardmonth will drag its helpless victim back into whatever cave or abandoned mine serves as its lair once it has completely paralyzed it. Unless it's been induced into a killing frenzy, in which case it'll rip the town apart. A large, blood-red fan folds over the Hardmonth's eyeless face. It is usually folded over, unless the Hardmonth is aggressive, in which case it undulates like a flower in the wind. Lilith, one of the smallest of the 5, the Lilith is especially tricky because it can change shape. The human female is one of its preferred forms. The form is usually small and unassuming, but it has a hypnotic spell that draws in large numbers of humans. There, it will almost always use its power to incite mass riots, genocides, purges, and other heinous acts. Liliths have been spotted at major historical events such as Jesus' crucifixion, the Trojan War, the Salem witch trials, Caesar's stabbing, World War II, and so on. When not in its preferred human form, the Lilith is a small, gelatinous, blob-like creature with 2 dark eyes and waving tentacles down its 2 sides. Iron is fatal to the Lilith, and in fact, the increasingly widespread use of iron is one of the reasons why humans will occasionally survive the Lilith, giving rise to many myths and fairy tales about witches and fairies. Undacitus, this monstrous demon prefers to live in bodies of water. Although it's been over a century, the last time an Undacitus was seen was deep in the Mariana Trench. Indeed, the last time this monstrous, enormous lizard shark was spotted, it inspired stories and legends that influenced Godzilla. It looks a lot like a modern shark, but it's bigger, scarier, has more rows of teeth, and is far, far smarter. Because it only appears every 100 to 200 years, little is known about this particular Demonia Animalis, but fellow catalogers and I believe it emits a specific sound. Similar to a whale's call? Instead of something soft and serene, this sound will cause humans to jump overboard or take the entire ship with them. It doesn't even eat people. It feeds on plankton. We believe it simply enjoys the kill. Montrum, this Demonia Animalis is mostly found in mountainous areas. Appalachian, Rocky, and Sierra Nevada demons are unusual in that they do not seem to enjoy the thrill of hunting humans. Instead, They eat local fauna such as wild goats and deer. One of their favorite snacks is the grizzly bear. We've become pretty lenient with these demons over the years, and it's only when they happen to cross paths with a human backpacker that they're put back on our radar. Montrum are typically 15 feet tall, weigh close to 700 pounds, have pure white or dark black fur, and stand on two legs. Human sightings, particularly those that manage to flee, have fueled the Yeti and Bigfoot legends. Is there a Bigfoot? If it did, the Montrum most likely ate it. The Montrum have been increasingly coming down from their mountain lairs and snatching people on the outskirts of cities in recent years. Is climate change influencing their usual diet of wild goats' migration patterns? Is it because of the wildfires? We are still unsure. We've had several reports of this happening in Denver, Colorado in the last 5 years. The Crown has moved this to our priority case as of last week. But, yes. Last but not least, I've saved the best for last. The Umbra is what we call it. The night. Even now, 500 years later, I'm still terrified of this one. I've only encountered it once, and I don't remember much about it. Actually, there isn't much to learn about this demon from the books. Fellow catalogers recall encounters with this entity, and the resulting PTSD is too much for them, with high counts of memory loss, mental hospitalization, and even suicide. This is what I know. 1. Has the appearance of a tall, dark, faceless man. 2. It prefers to hide in dark places, such as closets or beneath beds. And 3 more. If it catches you, it likes to strike a deal. Give me something you care about, and I'll let you live. My colleague survived an Umbra encounter. It happened on the same day I saw it. We were fighting a hardmonth in a deserted mall in southern Kentucky. It was large and ugly, and it resisted all attempts to subdue it and return it to its home dimension. We summoned reinforcements, more cousins, and retreated to the loading dock to wait while the hardmonth ripped up an Old Navy and Claire's. This is where things get hazy for me. I recall rushing in and scrambling to close the gate behind us. Because the hardmonth had been following us, we took extra precautions to secure the gate's 2 halves. We left a small gap because we couldn't get the chain tight enough around the broken lock in our haste. I recall how cold the metal felt between my fingers. Strange, given that it was the height of summer in southern Kentucky. The following 3 events occurred. 1. We could hear rustling behind us. My coworker turned to look at me. 2. I noticed him suddenly freeze. Listen, this man does not shiver. He'd been in the game for longer than I'd been alive, a hardened vet and a beast of a man. And that's saying a lot considering I'm nearly 500 years old. But that day, I felt him freeze like a mouse, trapped in the gaze of a hawk. 3. I felt like a child being picked up and shoved through the small gap we had left in the fence. The fence ripped large gouges in my face, neck, and chest, but they were nothing compared to the agony I could hear in my colleagues' screams. Then, I blacked out. I awoke a month later in the intensive care unit of a rural Kentucky hospital. I had no identification on me, and no one had been left to check on me in the chaos that the hardmonth had left behind that day. I found out what had happened to my colleague after I awoke, tore out the peripherally inserted central catheter, and returned home. Of course, he was gone. He was a strong man who refused to let the Umbra take someone he cared about. We don't know much about the Umbra, but we do know what happens when one of us is taken. For the Umbra is unique in that it is the only demon that will transport you back to the dimension from which it came. Nothing good ever happens there. Particularly to your flesh, your soul, and your spirit. His daughter is aware. The Umbra visits her once a year, on the anniversary of her father's death, and shows her exactly what happened to her father. And on that particular day, the Umbra offers her a choice. You're something he enjoys. I'll let him live if you give me you. So far, she has said no, as far as I am aware. I'm not sure which is scarier, the Umbra or someone I thought I loved letting the Umbra take me. But that's all for now on Monster Stories. Meanwhile, I have a stack of case files to finish, a full dishwasher to empty, and piles of laundry from my last trip. My 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom flat requires a thorough cleaning, and my black kitten, Spooky, requires a bath. I'll see how well this goes because he occasionally spits fire. My fellow demon hunters, until next time. My coworkers have all been complaining about how early it gets dark now. At the very least, they have small boxes over Zoom making small talk about the weather and weekends before our morning meetings. But I don't blame them. Talk like that is simple, structured, a formula with exponents that Jake in management and Talia from QA can easily fill in. What I have to say is not so simple. But I disagreed with my coworkers. I liked how dark it got so early. The nights had become a haven for me, in contrast to the days when I sit at home, immunocompromised and terrified, behind the screen of my laptop. Always hidden behind a screen. My town is small, but it's full of people who still believe in conspiracy theories about tracking chips in vaccines and post angry rants about privacy on Facebook, the irony completely lost on them. So I remain at home. It's fine because I live alone and am used to being alone. The only thing I miss are my walks, which I can still take because the entire town closes down around 9 o'clock. I leave my house around 10 o'clock. I turn off all of my technology and go outside for up to 2 hours, just walking around the neighborhoods around my apartment and enjoying nature. The streets are then deserted, with sidewalks illuminated by dull, buzzing street lamps and traffic lights cycling through their colors in the absence of any cars. I occasionally see other people, but any signs of life are usually nocturnal animals, opossums and raccoons and skunks, sniffing and stalking and living their lives at night just like I do. Perhaps that's where I went wrong. Maybe I saw myself as too much of a creature of the night when, in reality, I was just a tourist in it. I met a true creature of the night one night. He was almost a full block ahead of me when I first saw him, standing on the outskirts of a street lamp's beam. He was hard to see, but so was everything else on that night's walk. I had left later than usual, the moon was only a sliver of a crescent, and the sky was cloudy with the empty threat of rain. Even though it was about a half-hour walk from my apartment, I recognized the corner he stood on. I almost always saw wildlife there, a wild animal exploring the lawn beside where he was now standing. He was accompanied by a dog, which was leashed and crouching on the grass, the universal defecation pose. I assumed the man was older because he was leaning on a walking stick, patiently waiting for the dog to finish. I slowed my pace in the hopes of avoiding him. I'm not sure if it was simply allowing them space or some sort of instinctual fear. It felt like the latter, like when I mistook a hanging coat for a person in the dark. It wasn't even required. The dog had finished, and the man knelt down with a grocery bag to clean up after it. Then he reached down and removed the dog's muzzle. It shook with delight. He took a handful of something from his pocket and placed it in the dog's mouth. The dog sucked it up, tail wagging. The man had clearly trained it well, and his affection was visible. He patted the animal's head several times before re-muzzling it and tossing the rest of his pocket contents onto the lawn. They were off with a quick shake of the leash. In the way it walked, the dog appeared to be as old as the man, hobbling with joints that seemed to hurt with each step. They rounded the corner and vanished. If I hadn't kept going, that would have been the end of the encounter, the end of the story. But I didn't give up. I didn't see why I should. I'd only seen an old man and his old dog. I made my way to where he was standing for no particular reason other than it was the direction I was walking in. When I looked over at the grass to see what he'd left there, my suspicions were confirmed. A smattering of dog treats littered the yard. But there was something else on the sidewalk, not on the grass. I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't first investigated the treats, but there were dog prints on the cement, similar to what you see on sidewalks after it rains or when a sprinkler breaks. These, however, were not the faded gray of water, nor were they the ever-evaporating shadow stamps I was used to. But their color remained familiar. It was the rusted red of blood, and it made my heart race. A pair of dog prints followed the two as they walked, smeared in places like they'd been dragged and becoming lighter and lighter as they went. The shape seemed off as well, swollen and out of place, barely recognizable. Something, perhaps a rock or a twig, must have gotten into its paws, and the old man must not have noticed. I tried to follow the prints for as long as I could, but they vanished after a while, either due to blood clotting or them veering off the sidewalks. I couldn't tell which was which. It made me feel uneasy. Part of me wanted to go home, but another part of me was restless, still not done with my nocturnal existence. But both parts of me agreed, I didn't want to see anyone else tonight. A new neighborhood is being built near where I was, complete with vacant lots and construction equipment. I used to go there when I needed to be alone, like now, so I pointed myself in that direction. It was just what I needed. It was empty, a void that had yet to be filled. Shells of never-lived-in houses surrounded me, rising out of the ground like half-finished anthills. I started to relax, my shoulders slumping after tensing them without even realizing it. I was interested in seeing the progress of the model flagship, which was being built deep within the development. I got about halfway there, enjoying the sound of silence that only comes when there are no other humans around. That is, until the silence was broken. I'm not sure what drew my attention to his presence. It was like inspiration, nothing for a moment, and then it hit. Because there was no artificial lighting in the neighborhood at the time, I saw his shape more than anything else. He was standing on the front stoop of a half-completed house, its wooden frame eerily resembling a jail cell behind him. His dog sat behind him, almost as if he were a toddler with his mother. He leaned back on his stick and just stared at me. I called out to him, "Hello." He didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge my words, just kept his unflinching gaze on me. I didn't know what to do, so I continued to speak. "I'm sorry, but I believe your dog has been injured." "Who? Marley?" His tone was rough and raspy. He didn't seem to use it much. "If Marley is your dog, then absolutely. I saw some bloody paw prints earlier and I believe there isn't anything wrong with Marley." He cut me off with the declaration, the authority in his voice mirroring his own resolve. "I came here to save old Marley. He was an outcast. Didn't I find him out here late at night and take good care of him, boy?" Marley's head was scratched, but the dog didn't move. "Would you like to meet him? He doesn't bite or do anything else. Well, unless I tell him otherwise." He laughed quietly, which told me his joke wasn't really a joke at all. "That's fine. Just thought I'd let you know." In my head, there was a silent flashing, like a fire alarm without the siren, the same one I'd learned to trust in the past. "I have to get going anyway." "Yeah, what's a pretty little thing like you doing out this late?" That was all. This was no longer a discussion. I turned around and began walking as fast as I could without running. I expected him to continue talking to me, to yell at my back as I turned to face him, but he didn't. What I did hear was even more disturbing. There was a tremor, the jangle of a collar and leash, and the clicking of his tongue. "Come on, kid," I overheard him saying. I looked over my shoulder without pausing. He was about 20 feet behind me, not on the steps. The man walked faster than I thought he could, and Marley did his best to keep up with him. The man's movements were still jovial and childlike, despite the fact that he was still bathed in darkness. He acted as if he was playing tag. I couldn't think of anything else but getting away. The main road wasn't far away, and I knew that once there, I'd be able to attract someone's attention. It was pointless being out here. I began to run. Normally, hearing anything behind me would be impossible due to my own pounding heart and intake of breath. However, my senses were heightened, and I felt as if I could hear everything. It got closer with the steps and the jangle of the leash. And getting closer. I was sprinting at full speed, and he was closing the gap. My face was on fire, and my lungs were on fire. I knew I couldn't keep it up indefinitely. But the man appeared to be capable. Then everything fell silent. The sound of his footsteps behind me had faded, as had the rhythmic jangling of the leash. As I ran, I checked behind me once, twice, and 3 times. He had vanished. I had no idea where he was, but he was gone. I came to a halt, my chest ready to explode, and searched the area around me. Nothing. I wanted to cry and scream in relief all at once. But then he was back, inches away from me. The chase had ended. For the first time, I noticed he was holding the walking stick by the middle, and it wasn't a cane at all. It came to an end with a knitted plastic that was designed to be wrapped around people's necks. It was a pole for catching dogs. As he smiled at me, he held it with practiced finesse. "Atta, lady," he squealed. "You're doing fantastic." I took a step back, but he only moved closer to me. I scoured the ground for anything that could be used as a weapon against him. Instead, my gaze was drawn to his dog's feet. They weren't, however, dog feet. Sure, they were the right shape. But they were infected, gnarled and bloody. They were fingers. Hands of humans. The thumbs had been removed, and the remaining fingers had been bent at the knuckle and sewn together, resembling a dog's paw. Screws protruded in front of them, as if hammered through the back as a replacement for claws. His back legs were stumps, cut off at the knee, covered by sweatpants, the legs of it tied off at the ends. He was on all fours, a muzzle over his mouth. It was unnecessary, however, because he made no attempt to make a sound. He just stared, his eyes welling up with tears, his head and brows shaved above them. "Well, look at this, Marley. We appear to have made a new friend." I screamed for help. "I told you he was nice. I believe he likes you." An aluminum wire was stuck into his lower back to imitate a tail. The man picked it up and shook it as if it were wagging. Marley winced in pain beneath the muzzle. "Perhaps we'll get puppies out of this. Won't that be interesting?" Something in me snapped. I pushed myself back and sprinted away from him, away from the tortured creature on the ground, away from my own thoughts. There was a numbing sensation, as if I were watching it all on a screen. Just like it was on my laptop at home. I only looked back once after hearing him try to run after me. Marley was motionless. The man was attempting to drag him, but he refused. He looked at me with the same mournful expression in his eyes. The man yelled and hit Marley with the stick, but he didn't move. Despite all of this, he did not attack the man. He turned his heel. His training had not gone to waste. I made it back home, though I have no idea how. The next thing I recall is a howling sob I let out on my bed, behind closed doors, back inside, alone. He couldn't locate me here. I was secure. It took weeks for me to be able to go for a walk again. The next time I did it was around dusk, shortly after the end of the workday. I made my way to the street corner where it all began. I'm not sure what I was hoping to find. Maybe whoever Marley was standing there escaped and became a man again. However, it was empty. I stood there for a few moments, wondering what had happened to him and the man, if it was all a nightmare. A chipmunk scurried by below me. It picked something up from the grass and stuffed it into its already stuffed cheeks. I leaned in to look, knowing exactly what I was going to see. The yard was strewn with sweets. I returned home before it got dark. Someone once told me that working shifts would cut years off your life. I'm not sure if that's true or if there's any science to back it up, but I still believe it. It's hell if you've never worked a shift before. Every week, the schedule is altered. You're in when you're in, and you live your life accordingly. Perhaps a job with reasonable hours would be more manageable. Something from a restaurant or a store. Yes, it's still a bad deal. However, it is a functional shit deal. But what about warehouses and factories? That's another goddamn story entirely. I've done a lot of late shifts before. They're not enjoyable. When you spend most of your time sleeping during the day and working at night, you don't have much time for anything else. It messes with your circadian rhythm, and you'll just switch things up again in a week when they put you on days. I'm not sure how anyone is supposed to deal with it, but I'm guessing the guys doing the shifts don't see it as their P-bobulum. They P-bobulably assumed we'd figure it out and put as little thought into it as possible. Anyway, my point is that shift work stinks, which is one of the reasons I refuse to do it these days. When I was younger, perhaps. Sure. What the hell happened? I was desperate for money and couldn't afford to be picky. Temp agencies are used by all of the warehouses and factories in my area. Any job you got wasn't guaranteed to be yours the next day. They only brought you in when they needed you, which meant you'd have a consistent job right up until the 3-month hiring deadline. Then you'd have a week or two where you weren't needed. Then it's back to it. Rinse and repeat, assuming you didn't start the cycle with someone else right away. But there was always the possibility of being hired on. Maybe if you worked hard enough, if you demonstrated that you were committed and willing to take the shit jobs no one else wanted, they'd see you as someone worth their time. Nowadays, I'm wiser. Temp agencies, factories, and warehouses are all filled with garbage. Sure, there could be some legitimately good ones out there. But I'm willing to bet those are uncommon. Most of them in my town are happy to keep as many people as possible on the temp worker treadmill. But now I'm beginning to ramble. My original point was that I no longer care about impressing these jerks. I only care about my paycheck. That's why I now only work during the day. When my temp agency calls about a night shift, or my current PL Danman attempts to PL Dan me on one, I always say no. If they ask me why, I will always lie. Usually, saying I have to watch my kids is sufficient. I don't have any children, but they have no idea. Little white lies like that, in my opinion, are a lot better than explaining to them why I'll never work another night shift in my life. It's more than just the fact that the hours are terrible and that you'll die slowly. It is much more than that. I don't go out at night at all. Since that night at Jefferson's, I haven't done so in about 5 or 6 years. That was my last night shift ever. It was February, which is usually a shit show in my part of the world. Winter in my area is relatively mild from November to mid-January. But, come February, all bets are off. That is when blizzards strike, and they always strike hard. I've had to dig my car out of the goddamn snow to get to work before, and I've had to trudge through snow drifts almost knee-deep just to walk through the parking lot of whatever warehouse I was stuck at for the day. It's not enjoyable. Anyway, it was February, and the forecast called for a blizzard that night. Freezing rain, sleet, and the whole 9 yards. It sounded bad, and when I got the call about a late night shift opening at Jefferson's, I was understandably hesitant to go out in what was shaping up to be the worst storm of the year. Having said that, I still had bills to pay. I needed the money. So, whether I liked it or not, I agreed to work the midnight shift at Jefferson's. To be fair to the establishment, Jefferson's wasn't all that bad. It was a little more relaxed than some of the previous warehouses I'd worked in, and I had some friends there. Dan, one of my friends, was working there at the time. Dan was a nice guy. Dan was probably one of the nicest guys I ever met. I'd known him since I was a kid, and even though he wasn't much older than me, I guess I still looked up to him a little. Like an older sibling or something. He was the one who was there for me after my father died. He was the type of guy who couldn't stand seeing people in pain, and if he saw someone in distress, he'd do everything in his power to make it better. That was something I always admired about him. He'd encourage me to hang out with him and his brothers, and he'd plan stuff for us to do on the weekends. He'd even invited me to join him and his brothers on fishing trips, along with a couple of other kids he thought needed a fishing trip. Dan believed that going fishing would solve most problems. The water, and a cold beer are all you need. I couldn't argue with his reasoning. I wasn't sure if he'd be working the midnight shift as well, but to be honest, I was hoping he would. I would have preferred to see a friendly Dan. I slept for about 5 or 6 hours before getting up to drive myself to Jefferson's. I left around 10 a.m. to arrive at 11 a.m. The drive shouldn't have taken an hour, but the snow was getting worse. I didn't want to be late, despite the bad weather. I recall the drive and not being as difficult as I had anticipated. I still took my time and arrived early enough to eat at the Tyler's drive-thru. I arrived about 10 minutes before my shift was scheduled to begin. There were a few other guys there already, maybe 10 or so, hanging out by the lockers and donning their yellow vests. Some of them were well known. I'd previously worked with them, though we weren't exactly friends. I exchanged a nod with Sam, a coworker I'd met a few times before. He was a little older and scrawny, but he worked hard. Despite his gray hairs, he had more stamina than a man his age should have. He was talking to a young man named Johnny who I didn't know, and I watched as the two exited the locker room together. I noticed another familiar Dan coming in through the door around the same time they did. The one man I'd hoped to see. Dan's eyes immediately lit up when he saw me. As he approached to clap me on the shoulder, he burst out laughing. He hit me hard enough to make my bones tremble, even though I knew he wasn't serious. The only negative thing I could say about Dan was that he didn't always recognize his own strength. Mitch. Man, it's been a long time. How are you? Can't really complain, man. They drew you in too, didn't they? Dan shook his head. You've got to pay the bills somehow, you know? He went to one of the lockers, leaving his phone and wallet inside. He then grabbed a safety vest and made his way out onto the floor. I walked alongside him, shooting the shit as we went. The majority of the other guys had already gathered, waiting for the supervisor to issue our marching orders. That night, I recognized the supervisor on duty. Bobby Alden is the name of the individual. Maybe it's just me, but it seems like every warehouse supervisor is named Bobby, and they're all the same scrawny little fuck with a pocket protector on a power trip. The type of guy who brews craft beer in his basement and brings it to every social gathering, almost as if he knows it tastes like carbonated piss and takes sadistic pleasure in watching you drink it just to be nice. Bobby Alden, on the other hand, was that type of Bobby. The only thing that distinguished him was that he always seemed to have a cough. He couldn't finish a sentence without coughing or clearing his throat in the most obnoxious way possible. Herk, herk, herk. It sounded like a coughing fit. It's most likely a shallow reason to dislike a guy. But it really got on my nerves. He was shooting the shit with some of the guys when Dan and I arrived, and once he realized everyone was present, he began assigning everyone off. Alrighty. Guys, we've got a busy night ahead of us, so let's get started. You too. He motioned to a small group of 4 guys huddled together. I'll have you pack and wrap the skids. Herk, herk, herk. And you guys. He motioned to myself, Dan, Johnny, and Sam, as well as another person. We have some trucks that need to be unloaded. Tommy, you have the forklift. The remaining man, whose name was apparently Tommy, simply nodded and went to work. Bobby stayed with the packing team to supervise them, while I, Dan, and the rest of the offloading team went down to the loading bay to do our work. Warehouse work is as dull as shit, and once we got started, I couldn't say it was particularly interesting. Unloading a truck, at the very least, expedites the day. I'm guessing we spent about 3 hours going through the first truck. The majority of what was inside appeared to be soap or mouthwash. I didn't look at it very closely. We were nearing the end of the truck when Dan sat down to rest on a pile of skids. I recall him saying, "Do you hear that wind, man?" I was aware of it. The metallic thudding sound of the snowstorm's howling winds crashing against the building. The noise was louder inside the truck, but you could hear it echoing off the walls whenever it wasn't drowned out by Tommy's forklift. "You're insane, man," Dan muttered. "I'm wondering how bad it is out there right now," Sam said as he stepped out of the truck. "Do you think we'd get hell if we looked?" Dan simply shrugged. "What the fuck are they going to do?" He stood up and checked to make sure Bobby wasn't watching us before walking over to one of the empty loading doors and flipping the switch to open it. The door slowly rolled open, revealing a swirling mass of white on the other side. We should have been able to see the streetlights from the road, as well as some of the nearby factories, from there. But we couldn't even see the truck we were unloading through the snow. Dan let out an awe-inspiring whistle as we stared into the storm. "Fuck me. Vape," he said. "We're probably going to sleep here. Has anyone brought a blanket?" I laughed, though a part of me wondered if it would still be this bad when my shift ended. Even if it wasn't, my car was almost certainly going to be buried. "That is insane," Johnny said before he trailed off. Dan went to close the door, only to be stopped by Johnny's voice. "Wait. Is that someone out there? Is there anyone out there? In this case?" Dan furrowed his brow. He looked out into the storm, only to have his eyes widen slightly when he saw what Johnny saw. Holy shit. Yes, there is. It took me a moment to notice it, but once I did, it was difficult to miss him. I could make out the outline of a man walking through our parking lot. What is he doing out there? He's got to be freezing. Sam exclaimed. I don't think he's one of us. Perhaps a vagrant or something? I speculated. Dan appeared to be frowning slightly. I'm sure he was thinking the same thing I was. Who else would be out late at night in this part of town, wandering around in a snowstorm? Given Dan's nature, I suppose what he did next was the only thing Dan could have done. To be honest, it's probably what any reasonable person would have done. I'm not sure. On paper, it's easy to say that we should have just shut the door and left the guy in the snowstorm alone. But Dan was not like that. He couldn't just leave things alone. He had to pitch in. Hey, come over here, he said, cupping his hands to his mouth. Come on over here. Of course, none of us questioned what he was doing. I knew Dan was only trying to help. Perhaps Sam and Johnny did as well, and when Dan began calling out to the stranger in the snow, they did as well. Hey! Come on, people! Come over here! The man in the snow came to a halt and turned to Dan us. I doubt he could see us through the snow, but I'm sure he heard us. Hold on. Look over here. The figure began to approach the door slowly, shuffling towards us. Bobby came up to investigate what was going on out of the corner of my eye. There's a guy out there somewhere. Before he could even ask, I said. There's someone out in the storm. Bobby simply pushed past me to check it out for himself. Then he turned to Dan and me. Could you please get some coffee from the break room? Something spicy. That guy has got to be freezing his ass, he exclaimed. I didn't need to be reminded twice. I gave the stranger one last look before turning and jogging down to the break room. I used one of those pre-packaged instant coffee cups to get the guy something. I stepped out of the machine and looked back towards the loading dock to see how things were going. I was expecting to see Dan and the others assisting a man inside. Instead, I saw Sam and Johnny running frantically away from the door as Bobby and Dan attempted to close it. Jesus the Christ! I heard someone yell, and it took me a moment to realize what they'd already seen. Something crawled under the door as it began to close. I was too far away to see it clearly. All I can say is that it was shaped like a man, but it moved differently than any man I've ever seen. I watched as that thing crawled along the floor like an animal, moving at almost blinding speed, as soon as it got inside. It first looked over at Sam and Johnny before Bobby threw a box at it in an attempt to hurt it. Dan tried to grab it from the side, but whatever it was shrugged him off as if he didn't exist. He was attempting to restrain it 1 minute. He was on the ground the next thing I knew, and I could hear his screams. I stood there watching Bobby try to get that thing off of him. I could see some of the packing team members sprinting to assist. And I'm embarrassed to admit that I just stood there. Dan was terrified as whatever the hell that thing was ripped into him. When Bobby tried to hit it to get it to stop, it grabbed him and slammed him against the wall so hard that he left a smear of blood behind. I could hear his bones crunching all the way over by the break room. I watched as the packing crew recoiled at the sight of whatever it was and took off in the opposite direction. The man who'd emerged from the snow pursued them on all fours, letting out an inhuman shriek that echoed off the warehouse walls and made my entire body shake. I ran back into the break room, locked the door, and crouched behind it, praying to God that that fucking thing wouldn't find me. No prayers I could have said could have drowned out the screams. No. Nothing, in my opinion, could have drowned those out. I could hear a forklift moving somewhere in the warehouse, followed by a loud crash. I could hear men's terrified screams in their final moments. It felt like it went on for hours. However, it couldn't have lasted more than a few minutes. I could hear distant screams after the forklift crashed. I could hear bodies being thrown around, and then nothing. Only a pregnant silence descended. I remained where I was, my back against the break room door, as if I could keep whatever was outside from coming in. I knew there was no way I could have kept it out after seeing how easily it had picked up and killed Bobby. I was just hoping it wouldn't find me or sniff me out. Steps could be heard echoing throughout the warehouse. As whatever had killed everyone else patrolled the area, I could hear inhuman chirps and sounds. The lights eventually went out. Because they were activated by motion, there was no need to keep them on if a section of the warehouse was empty. When they were gone, I decided to sneak a peek out the window to see if that thing had gone. Lights were turned on at the far end of the warehouse, nowhere near the loading bay. It was still present. I saw it rummaging through a skid, tearing open boxes to see what was inside. I could see the blood on its hands even from a distance. The forklift was partially buried beneath some collapsed boxes, with Tommy still in the driver's seat. I could see a blood trail leading into a row of packed skids. And I knew I didn't want to see what happened at the end. Everyone had died. Everyone except me. I ducked back under the door, curled into a fetal position like a child. When the lights outside came back on, I tensed up again, covering my mouth so I didn't scream or make a sound. I could hear the man's shuffling footsteps from the snowstorm nearby, but I couldn't tell how close they were. I listened as they became louder and louder, and then faded. He was leaving. I remained motionless. I remained silent. The shuffling footsteps became a whisper as they got further away, drowned out by the howling wind. I'd never been more terrified in my life. When the lights went out again, I crept across the floor to the bathroom and shut the door as quietly as I could. I locked it and turned off the lights. I didn't get up until the morning. When the next shift came in, I nearly punched the guy who tried to open the door. It took a couple of guys to keep me from thrashing and screaming until I realized I was safe. Everything that followed is a blur. The police interrogations, the suspect lineup. In my memory, everything is hazy. Everything blends together like a dream. Dan, Bobby, Johnny, Sam, Tommy, and the rest of the gang. They were all gone. Each and every one of them. Something had entered and simply killed them. On my way out, I noticed some of the bodies. Most of them had been hidden, but I'm pretty sure they hadn't reached Johnny yet. It used to be Johnny, I believe. I didn't have much time left to get a positive ID on the body. Whoever it was has been haunting my dreams ever since. After the incident at Jefferson's, I took a few months off work. I spoke with a therapist. I spent some time at the bottom of a bottle before finally getting my SHT together. I tried looking for work outside of temp agencies but was unable to find anything suitable. I don't have the credentials to work in most other PL dons, and I don't have the time or money to get them. So I went back to the temp agencies. That's all there is to it. I'm used to it. Dan would have probably found a silver lining in all of this. That was his personality. But, sadly, I am not Dan. God knows I miss him every day. I sometimes wonder if I made the right decision by hiding like a chicken shit when that thing became violent. Maybe someone else would have died if I hadn't rushed in and tried to help Bobby pull it off of him. Or perhaps it would have killed me just as easily as it killed everyone else, and Dan would have preferred that I live. I'm not sure. I cannot speak on behalf of the deceased. In the end, I don't think it really matters whether or not I survive. They never found the man who was responsible for what happened that night. Of course, this is assuming that it was a man. I'm not sure if a human is capable of doing that to other people, but what do I know? All of the questions from the cops and all of the digging they did didn't turn up anything. The stranger from the snowstorm vanished into the night, and he never returned, as far as I know. Even if I wanted vengeance or closure, I wouldn't know where to begin. I simply no longer work nights and do not go out after dark. It's unlikely that I'll ever see that man again, but if I do, well, I'd rather not take any chances. I must publish this story. I believe that if I tell you, or even just someone, then I will be able to live with my decisions. I'm a private investigator and the owner of a small but very profitable investigation and consultancy business. My name doesn't matter. A wealthy customer contacted me to look into the disappearance of her sister, let's call her Monica, about 3 months ago. Since her parents always utilized their riches to bail her out as soon as she got into trouble as a child, Monica carried the same entitled attitude into adulthood. Most recently, Monica was sent into court-mandated treatment at a posh psychiatric and substance misuse treatment center called the Henderson Center after being pulled over for a DUI and being found in possession of more than a personal use quantity of certain very prohibited narcotics. After her required treatment period was up, Monica called her family to say she was done and that she was taking a cab back to her apartment. It was clear that she was still upset with her family for not using their great resources and power to get her out of forced rehab. She allegedly requested to be let out downtown and claimed to have errands to run, according to the driver. The last time anyone saw her was at that point. Her parents pursued this line of inquiry, offering incentives for information and engaging private detectives because the police feared she had come into conflict with some of her own dubious acquaintances. But my client had additional misgivings. She claimed that while speaking on the phone, her sister sounded unusual, her voice flat and untoned in contrast to how loud an extrovert she typically is. When questioned, the cab driver related a like tale. However, they did uncover rumors about the Henderson Center, including unethical experimental treatments, excessive secrecy, and other elements from the real-life horror stories of abusive mental hospitals in the early 20th century. None of the other investigation firms her family hired produced any concrete results. The fact is that Henderson consistently received top marks during routine inspections by state authorities. A police inquiry was not warranted, especially since Monica appeared to have left the center on her own and in good condition. Unfortunately, my own investigations were unsuccessful because a bureaucratic wall of silence prevented my small but extremely competent team of ombudsmen and trainee investigators from progressing. However, I didn't succeed in this business by accepting no as an answer. I succeeded by doing actions that others would never even contemplate. It turns out that getting yourself committed is not that difficult. After all, acting insane to get locked up isn't precisely the behavior that people would anticipate from a sane person. All it needed to get myself picked up and taken off for a 72-hour evaluation was a 911 call that used the proper buzzwords to persuade the operator that I would be a danger to both myself and others. I was one of the few psych patients from police processing that were brought to Henderson for treatment thanks to connections I'd made in the police department and municipal administration. Although it is a private hospital, they have an agreement to accept a specific number of cases from the county each month as a form of public service. I was able to start my research really once I got inside. Even though I knew it was a high-end facility that typically served the wealthy and connected when I entered, I was taken aback by how, lovely the setting felt. It appeared that the center's declared goal was to place patients under as little restraint as possible, just enough to assure their safety and the staff's, in order to foster a safe, supportive atmosphere for healing and therapy. This openness gave it a rather cozy sense and allowed me to walk around the area of the complex where my tiny private room was located with some degree of freedom. I could also use the wonderfully landscaped grounds, which were open for lower-risk patients to stroll. This park-like area was undoubtedly surrounded by a secret perimeter of electronic surveillance and security staff, but it was kept skillfully hidden from patients and other visitors to the facility. Even still, after 2 days at Henderson, I was starting to suspect that my client had sent me on a fruitless search because I had not discovered any proof of any suspicious activity at the complex. The guarded wards, where apparently high-risk patients were held, were the only site left to search. I knew that, in some locations, the part of the grounds adjacent to those wards was separated from the section I was allowed in by nothing more than a tall, dense hedge, which was difficult but not impossible for me to squeeze through unnoticed when the staff wasn't watching me too closely. Google Earth can be a pie's best friend in these situations. What I discovered on the other side wasn't alarming at first. A collection of patients arranged in 4 tidy rows, all looking in the same direction. I initially believed I had merely stumbled across some sort of planned group activity, but there was no staff member present, and no one directing the class. I moved forward while scowling. I carefully maneuvered around the group and walked up to them so they could see me in their peripheral vision before I got too close because I knew it was not a good idea to shock a patient in a mental hospital. "Hello," I called to them while scanning the area for any signs of employees. They remained silent and continued to look straight ahead. I approached one of the patients in the first row with caution. He was an elderly man with no hair on his head save for a thin white fringe. "Hello there." I spoke a little louder while sneaking a quick check around. I sprang back in horror as soon as I saw his face as he slowly turned to face me, sending a shiver down my spine. He stammered, "Hi," blinking his somewhat swollen, discolored, and unfocused eyes. When I was examining the history of abuse at mental health facilities in preparation for my inquiry at Henderson, I had previously seen faces that looked like that in images. The man had 2 black eyes, but they weren't the kind you get from fighting with your hands. This was the distinctive bruise left behind after a transorbital lobotomy, when a sharp surgical probe is inserted beneath the eyelids and into the brain via the eye socket's roof. After a few seconds, the elderly man with the bruised eyelids gently turned back to face the front without saying anything else to me. One more patient had bruises that were almost disappeared, and I observed 2 others with similar discoloration as I surveyed the slack, empty features of the patients standing in their orderly rows. I assumed the individuals with bruising were simply those who had the treatment most recently. They had performed the surgery on all of them, based on the entire group's submissive and captivated behavior. The practice of mass lobotomies was thought to be a thing of the past, a somber chapter in the history of medicine, but based on what I witnessed here, it was still very much alive at the Henderson Center. I took many images of the patients using the tiny digital camera I had managed to sneak into the hospital. This was the proof I required, and regardless of the inspection record's excellence, I knew it would be sufficient to at the very least trigger a state medical board investigation. I returned to the hedgerow and pushed my way through it once more, keeping my eyes tightly shut to prevent cutting my corneas as I did so. The hedgerow was tightly braided with tiny branches and leaves with sharp edges. I froze as I tried to open them from the other side. A short, older man with a grave countenance and a badly fitting brown suit turned to confront me. I knew him from my research. Dr. Henry Henderson was in front of me, surrounded by 2 strong hospital orderlies. He let out a deep sigh as his face darkened somewhat. "I genuinely regret that you saw that." My parents and I moved to Delaware when I was 12 years old, and I've been here ever since, with the exception of 6 months in Kentucky, which is irrelevant. Anyway, anyone from Delaware should know where this occurred. Fellows Pond. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Fellows Pond, it is one of Delaware's many state parks, with the typical amenities found at any state park located beside a pond. Nature trails, campgrounds, picnic areas, paddle boats, and other recreational activities. Fellows Pond is about 1.5 miles down the road from the trailer park where my parents and I used to live, just past the high school. What I'm about to tell you happened about 38 years ago, when I was 15 years old, and yes, I'm that old. Anyway, it was a hot summer day in 1984, specifically July 14th. How can I remember that far back? You inquire. That day, however, will live on in my subconscious mind forever. Saturday was the day. The morning began normally enough. I got up around 9 a.m., dressed, ate breakfast, said hello to my mom, and then went outside to play. Back then, instead of being glued to a TV screen or a phone, kids went outside to play with their friends. Anyway, I got on my bike and rode around the park, looking for my friends. I was riding by Brendan's house when I noticed him and his brother, Donnie, the Dula brothers, playing with matchbox cars on the concrete patio outside their parents' trailer. I came by and we played cars for a while before deciding to ride our bikes. Donnie then ran into the house to ask their mother, then returned seconds later, saying she said it was fine. "Let's go find Sarah," I exclaimed. Sarah Cox, the most beautiful girl in the world, now lived across the street from Brendan's parents' house. At least, that's what I thought. Brendan approached the trailer and knocked on the door. I was too tense. Sarah, on the other hand, answered the door. After a few seconds, she turned around and yelled through the door, "Dad! I'm out on my bike with the lads." "Okay, be careful," her father said. She then hopped on her bike and joined the pack. We used to refer to ourselves as the pack. Anyway, we drove around the trailer park a few times. The park, you see, was shaped like a horseshoe, with trailers on both sides. Sarah slowed down just in front of Chris's parents' house on our final lap around and said, "Let's see if Chris wants to ride too." We all hit the brakes at the same time, turned toward Sarah, and exclaimed, "Not Chris." He's a nice guy. If he can't ride, I can't either, she said, stomping her foot, crossing her arms, and pouting out her lip. Now, I believe this was the first time I let my hormones take precedence over my rational thinking. This was a trait I maintained throughout my adult life. Anyway, I'm fine with it, I said, trying to make a good impression on Sarah. Of course you do. Brendan responded, knowing exactly how I felt about her. All right, said the Dula brothers in unison. That was something they were always doing. Chris came running out of the house, wearing a helmet, elbow pads, knee pads, and gloves, before Sarah could even get off her bike. He was raised by these parents. He then got on his bike and rode over to us. Let me now introduce you to each member of the pack and Chris. Brendan, who was 16 years old at the time, was a big kid, not fat, but muscular, and he worked out all the time. He was the adventurous, outdoorsy type who liked guns, knives, archery, and martial arts. Donnie, his 14-year-old younger brother, was the polar opposite. He was slightly shorter than Brendan and very timid. While he enjoyed hanging out with Brendan when he did those things, he was too afraid to try them himself. He enjoyed gardening and writing poetry with his mother. Sarah, who was 15 at the time, was what most people would describe as a tomboy. I simply described her as lovely. She was short and chubby, but it was the good kind of chubby. No offense to any of the ladies out there. Although she was not into guns and knives like Brendan, she did climb trees, assist her father with car repairs, and build things with power tools. And pushed me. Absolutely insane. Anyway, Chris, who was 14 at the time, was extremely short and, for lack of a better word, simply annoying and extremely high-strung. It's not that any of us disliked him, it's just that he never knew when to stop talking and was extremely intelligent. He'd go on and on about statistics on this and percentages on that. It reminded me of a younger Reed from Criminal Minds. He was interested in bug collecting and astronomy. There was also me. I was tall and thin, with hair that was a cross between Don King, Jimi Hendrix, and Bob Ross. I was and still am, for the most part, a nerd. Thick black glasses, awkward, unattractive, and clumsy, completely obsessed with Sarah, writing song lyrics, and listening to heavy metal music. You know who I'm talking about. In any case, hey guys. Let's go down to Fellows Pond and ride the paddle boats. My mom said it was fine as long as I accompanied someone, and you're all someone, right? I can look for bugs, and you can do your thing. What do you think? Want to go? Do ya? Do ya? Huh? Chris spoke quickly and in a high-pitched, nasal tone. My God. Chris. Please. Quit talking, Brendan stated angrily. Okay. Sorry. What do you think? He expressed concern. We all nodded in agreement. We have to ask first. Sarah explained. Okay. Please notify your parents, and we will meet at the bus stop, Brendan said, as if he was the boss. We all did it and returned to the designated area. Everyone was free to leave. Let me tell you what you all want to know now that the introductions and setups are complete. We had to ride on the road now to get to Fellows Pond. This was before they installed the bike path. Anyway, Brendan was first, followed by Chris, Donnie, Sarah, and me. The view was breathtaking. Anyway, we arrived at the high school, which was roughly halfway between the trailer park and Fellows Pond, when Chris exclaimed, "Come on guys. I have a shortcut," and then turned right into the high school entrance. As Brendan turned around and did the same, we followed. We rode past the pool, through the student parking lot, to the football field, past the farthest goal post, and into the woods behind the school. Chris then came to a halt, got off his bike, and sat it down. We all did the same thing as we arrived. "Come on," Chris said as he walked into the woods. "Wait a second. Where are we going?" Brendan inquired. Chris came to a halt. "We go through these trees until we come to a fence, then we go over the fence, walk about 50 yards, and we're at the campgrounds, then the picnic area, and then the paddle boats," Chris explained. "How do you know that?" Donnie inquired. "Yeah." We all said at the same time. "Oh. My parents rented a cabin for the weekend about 6 months ago, and I got lost. I went off behind the cabin, found the fence, climbed over it, walked a little further, and came to this. When I returned an hour later and told my parents what had happened, my father whipped my buttocks." Chris exclaimed, "Let's go. I couldn't sit down all day." "I'm up for it," Sarah explained. "Me too," I explained. I didn't want to go, but I didn't want to appear a wuss to Sarah. 2. Hormones. 0. Rational thought. "Anyway, okay," the Doula brothers said once more. Chris went first, followed by Sarah, then I pushed Donnie playfully aside to get behind Sarah, Donnie followed me, and Brendan came last. We walked a short distance until we reached a chain-link fence about 6 feet high, climbed over it, and began walking through the woods. Chris, the high-strung kid that he was, then took off running, leaving us in his wake. "Chris! Stop!" we all exclaimed. "Come on!" he yelled back as he vanished into the trees. We heard what sounded like twigs and branches breaking and Chris yelling for help. We all bolted in the direction of the screams. When we arrived at a small clearing, Chris was half submerged in the ground, with only his torso sticking out. "Wait a minute," Sarah said as she came to a halt. Brendan, Donnie, and I dashed over to help him. "Everyone, stop. It's a snare. Someone covered a hole with branches. They're attempting to capture wild animals, I just read an article about it," Brendan screamed. We came to a halt. Brendan was about 3 feet away from Chris, who was sobbing at this point. "It's okay, Chris," Sarah assured him, "you'll be fine." She then covered her mouth and cried. Brendan then removed his shirt and turned to face us, saying, "Give me your shirts, I have a plan." We took off our shirts, all except Sarah, and threw them to Brendan, who tied them together like a rope and told Chris, "I'm going to throw this to you. We'll pull you out if you catch it and hold on tight. Guys, get behind me, Donnie, you hold on to me, Mike, you hold on to Donnie, and pull, hopefully the branches will hold," he said to us. Brendan then tossed the rope. Chris caught it on his first attempt. "Ready? Pull," Brendan explained. As Chris emerged, we slid across the branches that covered the hole. He stood up as we all hugged him, Sarah included, relieved that he was okay. "Where did you get that?" Chris turned to look at the hole and said, "It wasn't there before." "I want to go home," Chris exclaimed, completely overwhelmed, and who could blame him? Anyway, we were all about to return to the fence when we heard a small voice say, "Hello? Is anyone present?" We all came to a halt and looked around. "Hello? Down here," said the voice again. "Please assist me. Please." Then we all stared at the hole. "There's no way," Brendan explained as he began to pull the branches away from the hole. We all began to pitch in. The hole was revealed after a few seconds. It was a large hole, about 6 feet wide and 10 feet deep, possibly deeper. We were all looking down. "Please assist me. Please," cried the trembling little boy. He wore only his tighty-whitey underwear and had short red hair. "Oh. My God. We have to help him," Sarah said. "Hurry. He'll be right back," the child said through tears. Mike, Donnie, sit on my back to hold me down, Brendan said as he lay down on the ground. As Brendan threw the rope of shirts into the hole, he extended his arm down as well. Grab it, kid, I'll pull you out, he said, jumping up and down. Jump? Suddenly, I felt Brendan's body move forward slightly, as if he had grabbed the rope. Brendan then started pulling on the rope until we could see the top of the child's head emerge from the hole. I reached out a hand to him, and he grabbed it, climbing over Brendan and out of the hole. He collapsed to the ground, shivering and sobbing. Donnie and I then stepped away from Brendan as he stood up, untied the shirts, and placed them over the child. We huddled around him on the ground, kneeling. He was about 9 years old, filthy, and covered in cuts all over his body. Are you able to walk? Brendan inquired. The youngster nodded. So, let's go. Brendan explained. We heard the sound of an old diesel engine nearby as the kid began to get up. He's returned. The trembling child screamed. Everyone go hide. Brendan exclaimed softly. We all started running. Donnie and Chris walked to the left. Sarah and I took the right path. Brendan and the child also turned left. Sarah and I dashed about 10 feet before hiding behind a large tree stump. I would have been the happiest kid in the world under different circumstances, but not now. I was terrified to death. As it idled nearby, the diesel engine roared on. Sarah then grabbed my hand. I fixed my gaze on her. I'm terrified, she said, her eyes welling up with tears. Me too. We'll be fine, I replied, squeezing her hand. We suddenly heard the loud cracking sound of twigs and branches being broken as a result of something heavy stepping on them. When I turned around, there was this monstrous man walking through the woods, holding a large knife in one hand and a live chicken in the other. He was grasping the chicken's legs. He was a large behemoth of a man, about 7 feet tall, incredibly fat, and walked with a grunt. His face was wrinkled and aged. He was dressed in old army boots, dingy blue mechanic's coveralls, and a red hat. His hair was gray and long. It's dinner time, boy, he said in a deep wheezy voice, raising the chicken in front of him and swinging the knife, severing its head. As the chicken's head fell to the ground, blood poured out of it and all over him. The chicken is still alive. He walked right past Sarah and me. My nose was filled with the faint odors of motor oil, old dirt, and piss. As he approached the hole, he realized it had been uncovered, and his capture had vanished. He screamed like a maniac, raised the knife to the sky, tossed the chicken into the hole, and ran through the woods, screaming, grunting, and wheezing. Donnie and Chris emerged from the woods shortly after. Guys! Where have you gone? Donnie inquired, loudly but quietly. Sarah and I then dashed over to them. What happened to Brendan and that kid? Sarah inquired, wiping her tears. I'm not sure. Donnie responded. Brendan. We all burst out laughing. In retrospect, that was not a wise decision. While we were yelling for Brendan and looking around, the piss-smelling, chicken-killing mechanic from hell emerged from the woods, about a foot from the hole behind him. He laughed sinisterly and coughed repeatedly afterward, as if he'd been smoking for 50 years. I had one little piggy, and now I have 4 little piggies, and what a pretty piggy you are, he said, his voice shaky, staring at Sarah. Come here, piggy, piggy, he said as he raised the knife and approached us. Chris yelled. What exactly do you want? I yelled as I took a step in front of the 3 of them. Aren't you the brave little piggy? He exclaimed, laughing again. What the fuck are you looking for? I yelled at him. I'm after the boy. Bring him to me, and I might let you live. Now, where is he? He asked. Right now. Asshole, asshole. Brendan yelled as he emerged from the woods and swung a massive tree limb directly at the psycho's head. The limb smacked him in the face, knocking him back. He was perched on the ledge of the hole. Brendan then executed a spinning heel kick, striking him in the chest and knocking him backwards into the hole. Soon after, a loud thud was heard, followed by the most sickening, guttural scream that still haunts me to this day. "It's the truck. Let's get started," Brendan yelled as we all dashed toward the campgrounds. We arrived to find a battered, filthy Ford F-350 with Massachusetts plates and the engine running. "You come with me, kid. Get in the back, you four," Brendan exclaimed. As Brendan and the kid got into the cab, we did. "Wait a minute," he yelled as he shifted into drive and flew out of there like a bat out of hell. Dust, dirt, and rocks were flying around everywhere. We took the path leading to the main road. Brendan then came to a complete stop, yelled out the window, hit the gas, turned left, and made his way to the police station. We all walked in together. Brendan informed the lady behind the desk of what had occurred. They took the kid in the back right away, and we never saw him again. They also seized the truck. We were told to wait in the sitting area after giving her our names, addresses, and phone numbers. After a few moments, 2 police officers emerged and led Sarah, Donnie, and Chris to the back. They returned to the sitting area about 30 minutes later, then escorted Brendan and I to separate interrogation rooms in the back. This is the story I told them. We returned to the sitting area, where our parents greeted us. While the officers were speaking with us, the lady at the desk apparently called them. Anyway, 2 of the officers then asked my mother and Brendan's mother if we could accompany them back to the scene. Both of our mothers agreed. Sarah returned home with her father, while Chris returned home with his mother. Donnie remained at the station with his mother and my mother. Anyway, Brendan and I hopped in the cop car and drove back to the campgrounds, where we got out and walked back to the hole. Except for the knife and the dead chicken, it was empty. Officers recovered the knife and kept it as evidence. We then drove back to the station, where we were told we could leave. Brendan and Donnie accompanied their mothers, while I accompanied mine. A few days later, a newspaper article told the story of a 9-year-old boy discovered by 5 teenagers at Fellows Pond. It also revealed the boy's name, only as Bobby S., and displayed a picture of the boy. It was the same boy we had discovered. It also stated that Bobby, who was abducted from a Boston mall 3 weeks ago, had been safely returned to his family. Given that we were all under the age of 18, our names were not revealed. It only mentioned us as the 5 teenagers. Anyway, I assumed the 5 of us didn't talk to each other for about 2 weeks as we tried to process what had happened. When we finally spoke again, we agreed not to tell anyone who didn't already know that we had found the boy. Chris and his family soon moved away, and Sarah went to live with her mother in New Hampshire. She was never seen by me again. Brendan, Donnie, and their families, as well as my family, stayed in the trailer park. Brendan joined the Marines right out of high school and was soon shipped off to boot camp. Donnie received a literary scholarship to Princeton and relocated there after graduation. I stayed close to home. When I was 16, I got a job at the local grocery store and have been there ever since. Soon after I turned 18, my father found work in North Carolina. Mom and Dad signed over the trailer to me, and I've been here ever since. Sarah still writes to me on occasion, and I see Brendan when he comes home on leave. I no longer see Donnie or Chris. As far as I know, that psycho-mechanic fucker was never apprehended. Now, the pact I mentioned earlier has remained with me all these years. Until now, that is. Because now, I'm terrified. When I got home from work today, I discovered a dark blue Continental 10-speed bike with the initials MPZ scratched into the frame, just below the seat, leaning up against my front door. The same bike I'd abandoned at the edge of the woods. It was 38 years ago.